From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Mark Sweeney. I'm Chief of the Humanities and Social Sciences Division here at the Library of Congress, and I want to welcome you to another in a series of occasional lectures sponsored by the Humanities and Social Sciences Division. This event is also being co-sponsored by the African and Middle Eastern Division. The Humanities and Social Sciences Division provides reference and research service assistance through 3 reading rooms in the Library of Congress, the main reading room, the local history and genealogy reading room, and the microform reading room. We have 3 other upcoming events that I want you to be aware of, so you can mark your calendar. One is that on Monday, President's Day, the main reading room will be open to the general public for a visit. Welcome to have photography, children, anyone under the age of 16 who are normally not allowed as researchers in our reading room. We do this twice a year on Columbus Day and President's Day, so you're more than welcome to come in and enjoy the room, talk to our staff about what it's like to work at the Library of Congress. Also, on Tuesday, February the 28th, at noon in the Pickford Theater, the Rare Book and Special Collections Division, along with the Hebraic section of the African and Middle Eastern Division and HSS, are co-sponsoring a program about a forthcoming documentary, The Rosenwald Schools by filmmaker Aviva Kempner. Julius Rosenwald, a philanthropist of the Sears Roebuck Empire, partnered with Booker T. Washington in the early 20th century to build over 5,000 schools for rural African American communities in the South. And our Rare Book division holds the Lessing Rosenwald collection. He was the son of Julius Rosenwald. And our manuscript division holds the Booker T. Washington papers. And also on Friday, March the 16th at noon, author Joseph Frucioni will discuss his recent book, Faulkner and Hemingway, Biography of a Literary Rivalry, published by Ohio State University Press. So enough for the advertisements, I'm sorry. But so today's lecture connects well the library's collections on religion, Christianity and Islam, world history and politics. This event was planned by our reference specialist in religion, Cheryl Adams. Thank you very much. And Cheryl will introduce the speaker. After Mary Jane Deeb, Chief of the African and Middle Eastern Division, provides us with some additional remarks. So, Mary Jane.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Cheryl. Cheryl Adams has been just wonderful. She has organized the program, and I really feel that we have done almost nothing to help out, but we do co-sponsor programs with other divisions. Sometimes we take the initiative, sometimes the other division takes the initiative. In this case, HSS has done that. So I want to thank Cheryl and Mark very much. The African Middle East Division holds also programs in its reading room. We have 3 sections, the African section, the Hebraic section, and the Near East section. And each of those sections has programs, readings, poetry, shows films, holds conferences, and exhibits in the various fields and regions of the 78 countries for which the division is responsible. I would like to make a little push for one of the programs we're going to have very soon, and that is we're having a major exhibit on the Armenian book, and Dr. Abdo here is the organizer, curator, thinker behind this exhibit. It will be in just a few weeks in April. The opening is on April 18th, and I would like to invite you all to come. And I just want to welcome Jonathan Lyons again. The last time he was here, he was talking in our reading room. He had another book on Iraq at that time, on Dar al-Hikmah, and he gave a wonderful presentation. So I'm sure you must all be looking forward to hearing him. But before that, Cheryl Adams will introduce him. So thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Cheryl Adams in the main reading room, a reference specialist for religion. Are there, I guess we've got a few people, but as people come in, if you raise your hand, if you've got a seat near you, that would help folks. I just want to say that if you have a cell phone on, if you could turn that off, that would help our speaker. I also want to say that this program is being webcast, so if you raise your hand for a question later on in the program, you are giving us permission to use your image or your voice in our webcast. In Islam Through Western Eyes, to quote Columbia University press release, Jonathan Lyons unpacks Western habits of thinking and writing about Islam, conducting a careful analysis of the West's grand totalizing narrative across 1,000 years of history. Pretty complicated. But I just want to give you some sense of Jonathan's ability to create an absorbing and engaging narrative about a very complex topic.
Move the microphone up a little bit.
Yes, thank you, Sharon. Can you hear me better now? Is that better? I need to be closer. Is that better? Okay. I want to give you some sense of how good Jonathan is about creating an engaging and absorbing narrative about a very complex topic. Last summer, we discussed this book talk. He had not quite, the book wasn't published yet. And so he gave me a copy of his earlier book, which is The House of Wisdom, How the Arabs Transformed Western Civilization. It was summer. I took it to the beach. And in between swims, I was transported to the medieval world quite happily. It was fascinating. So it was really, really good. Jonathan is a scholar of the Muslim world, but he also spent 20 years as a correspondent and also editor at Reuters, much of it in the Islamic world. And as Louis H. Lapham, editor of Lapham's Quarterly, notes, Jonathan Lyons joins the wisdom of a scholar with the knowledge of a journalist. And this makes for a very engaging combination of research and experience. Jonathan has a doctorate in sociology from Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. He's taught at Monash University, and as well as George Mason University and Georgetown University's Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. In addition to the books that I have mentioned, he has also co-authored Answering Only to God, Faith and Freedom in 21st Century Iran. Jonathan clearly has the credentials to tackle this very complicated topic relating to how we in the West look at the Islamic world. But what I find most interesting is how the questions he poses as he looks at his research, and those can be summed up in a couple of questions that he puts on his website, which is, why do we think about the things the way we do, and what if we allowed ourselves to think differently? Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Lyons.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Mary Jane and Mark Sweeney. I have to be honest, I've never really been accused of being the author of beach reading before, but I'll take it. I might suggest that Islam Through Western Eyes came through a different channel of creativity, so I might not suggest that you take it to the beach, but I wouldn't stop you. I'm delighted to be back. As Mary Jane said, I've spoken at Library of Congress before. And I'm also pleased to recognize so many faces of the research team that I see on the 3 to 4 days I'm in the Adams room and have been for most of the last 4 or 5 years of my life. I've written all or parts of 5 books there. I have a new one that's 90% complete. You may not recognize me, I understand, in a suit and tie. I usually wear the sort of khaki clothes that I used as a correspondent in the Middle East for so many years. But if you need to find me, I'm usually sitting at table 326 unless someone's gotten there first. So it's great to be here. So I want to begin today's lecture with just brief synopsis of how this book came to be, because I think that will tell you a lot about where I'm going to go. There are two sort of sources. One is personal. I was posted in Iran. I had the pleasure of being the only full-time accredited correspondent in post-revolutionary Iran who was also an American citizen. I was there for Reuters, which meant British in the eyes of the Iranian authorities, but they knew I was an American and they were very pleased. It was the time of Khatami, a lot of anticipation that Iran might be following a path that would be more welcome among most Western states. Anyhow, a lot of what I did, and the book that I eventually produced, to which Cheryl alluded about Iran, is grounded in my understanding of Iranian religious politics. So I spent a lot of time in the holy city of Qom, and I spent a lot of time with the Ayatollahs. Now, as you probably know from reading the press, these encompass a series of ranks of clerics who are often, in my view, lampooned in Western accounts. And I found extremely dedicated scholars who were a wealth of knowledge. And when I would ask them a question, they would break the question down into its constituent parts, and they would play it back to me, and then they would give me this beautifully reasoned response. And I realized that this is probably the last true practitioners of a real Aristotelian type of education. And so far from being a sort of bloodthirsty, medieval throwbacks, I thought, these people are really interesting. So I had this sort of built-in dissonance, if you will, between what we're told consistently in the media and frankly in academia and in the books that we read and the newscasts that we watch and the movies that we see and the still pictures that we get, and my own experience. So already there was this fissure between what I was seeing and experiencing and what I was being told to experience or led to expect to experience. So I'm going to take you back to a certain day in 2001, September. However, not the day of the terrorism attacks, but 5 days later, when George Bush appeared in front of the media and gave this rather remarkable statement, which I have here on the slide. And he wrote, "This is a new kind of evil, and we understand, and the American people are beginning to understand, this crusade, this war on terrorism is going to take a while." Now, you may recall the word crusade caused quite a flap. The White House rushed out to apologize. I was then working as a senior editor at Reuters, recognized a good story when I saw one. If you Google it, you can probably still find it. I wrote it. I interviewed all sorts of experts about the meaning of crusade, its contemporary resonance in the Middle East and among scholars, among Muslims of all stripes. Had a lot of fun with it, but it never left me. And so once the immediate rush of news reporting out of the aftermath of the attacks was over, I began to give this pretty serious thought. Now, Bush, despite the apologies, repeated this again 5 months later, and his underlings, particularly John Ashcroft and some others, really engaged in this notion of a East-West medieval religious conflict. Summed up in what you may recall was a very popular rhetorical question of the day: why do they hate us? And I'll come back to that question later. So this discourse remains, I would argue, common today in the public sphere. You can find it on the internet, in the press. It's picked up by all public opinion surveys. The Pew Research surveys on religion do a particularly good job of illuminating this. And just the other day, one of the candidates for the Republican nomination for president revived this notion of crusade in a rather revisionist fashion. So it's still very much out there. And I'm going to try to show you how a lot of these ideas, whose genesis really sat with the First Crusade, are with us today, and why that's so important that we need to understand it. So now let's go back a little bit further, in fact, to 1095, when Pope Urban II, in his famous speech at Clermont, proclaimed the First Crusade. Now, we don't have an exact text. There are about 6 accounts that are extant of what he said. All of them overlap in certain ways, and in the book, I talk quite specifically about how these different versions of what he said or may have said evolved over time. But they all strengthen my thesis, which is captured in this version. God has conferred upon you above all nations a great glory in arms. Undertake this, brackets, crusade for the remission of your sins with the assurance of the imperishable glory of the kingdom of heaven. So we have this use of the word crusade and this whole apocalyptic tone that surrounds the early days of what became known later as the War on Terrorism. As I mentioned, I was an editor at the time and followed this evolution quite closely. But it sort of got under my skin, and I began to explore this prevailing discourse of Islam, or as I prefer to call it, an anti-Islam discourse. Over time, this journey took me away from journalism. I'd been at Reuters 21 years, and I had been in journalism for 5 or 6 years before that. And I wanted to devote myself to this project, so not only did I bury myself in the Library of Congress, I picked up a PhD in sociology, actually sociology of knowledge, or sociology of religion is kind of my subfield. So you've already heard me use the word discourse once or twice, so let's take a look at how I'm using it and what it means. I'm using it in this sense, as a totality of images, texts, ideas, concepts. And this is a crucial point. These discourses define what we can say about Islam, or any subject, and what we cannot say. And I'm also looking at the institutional practices that flow from these texts. So by that I mean the security laws and the regulations, legal rulings, briefing papers, policy documents. I look at patriotic slogans, the lapel pin, and of course the notion of a war on terrorism. And perhaps in the Q&A, if you want, we can go a little deeper into how I do this. So these institutional practices, in my opinion, flow directly, inexorably even, from this discourse. So to give you an example, botany. I came in today, it's kind of raining, but I gave a similar talk at Georgetown recently. It was a lovely sunny day, and I saw crocus. Now, if I came into this room and said, there's a crocus popping up through the cold today, you might say, well, that's a nice statement, but you would know intuitively, in quotes, that that's not a statement about botany. That's just a statement about what I saw involving a plant. So the discourse of botany that we don't think about but is out there helps us decide that casual observation about a winter flowering of a plant is not a scientific term. It's not a term that is within the value of science of plants. And we'll see how that plays out with the Islam discourse as well. Now, having defined or attempted to define discourse, let me talk about my analysis, discourse analysis. Now, there are different types. If we have any linguists in the room, you probably know about critical discourse analysis. People spend their lifetime, and it can be very interesting, reading how often is the passive voice used in contemporary news coverage, or how do doctors write their prescriptions, and you can do syntactical analysis. I don't do any of that. I don't do a linguistic analyses of texts or statements. What I'm looking for are these broader epistemological and philosophical questions. Secondly, I focus on what's been called serious speech, this lecture. Classroom lectures or notes, textbooks, news media, serious writing that's meant to teach, to be retained, passed along, absorbed. I'm seeking to uncover the rules that oversee the production and reproduction of these statements as constitutive of knowledge. So what are the rules, to go back to my previous example, that leads us to think that an observation about a crocus in February is not a statement within botany? To give you another historical example, in the medieval period, a period that I've studied quite a lot, the bestiary was a very common literary text. It was a morality play grounded in the behavior of animals. So in medieval bestiaries, the panther is often seen as a loyal animal. We know the bee is industrious, the ant, etc. Those tell us about morality and human social organization, but they don't tell us anything about panthers or bees or ants. So I'm interested in that process. Now, it's very important as well to understand, and this is a sticking point for a lot of people who do the kind of work that I'm interested in, is that, in my opinion, and in this view, the authors of these statements, George Bush in this case that I gave you earlier, is not aware of these rules or the understanding or the effect at which they're controlling his statements or statements about Islam. So they're outside their knowledge, outside their control, and therefore outside their ability to change or to limit. And then finally, as I mentioned, I'm interested in their subsequent transformation into a discipline. So when you study Islamic studies at university, what do you read? So I would be asking the question, well, what are we not reading? Security studies. What are we looking at? What are we not looking at? What are the texts we study? What are the texts that we avoid or overlook? So where does this all lead me? Well, relying in part on the classic work of Norman Daniel, a scholar who published a wonderful book in the 60s and then revised his work following several decades on Islam and the idea of Islam in the West, I developed this little chart. And these are the main trends that I've seen in my analysis and research into the early discourse of Islam. Now, before I take you through it, I just want to point out that the earliest European Christian encounters with the world of Islam in the form of Arab raiders or pirates, including the sacking of Rome, all took place without any reference to what it is that these Arabs might believe. So they were seen as barbarians. If you go and read the Venerable Bede, if you go and read some of the chronicles of this period, they'll say, oh, the Arabs came in and they burned our ships. God willing, they'll go away. Or the Arabs took this town, but with God's help, we drove them out. And you read the very same references to the Saxons or the Vikings or the Magyars. So in other words, what I'd like to say is that the Arab, at this point, the Muslim Arab was an undifferentiated experience. It was a bad thing. It was barbaric. But it had no meaning as far as the existential values and existence of the Christian world. Now that begins to change. That begins to change in the run-up to the Crusades, when a mobilizing discourse, the one that I'm studying, is really developed somewhere around the end of the 11th century. And this is what I found. What's important to this, and you'll notice right away, is that Islam here is the inverse or the mirror opposite of Christian values. So Christianity is portrayed as a religion of love and peace. Islam is invariably portrayed as a religion of hate and violence. Christianity is a religion of truth. Muhammad is a false prophet. Islam is a religion of falsehood. Christians are chaste and pure. Muslims are sexually perverse. In fact, there's a whole literature in the early Christian analysis of Islam, written, mind you, before the Christian world had any real experience of Islam or the Muslims. And this literature says that it was only by bribing his male followers with the promise of polygamy and other sexual advantages was Muhammad able to secure conversion. And then finally, we have Christ, and again, Muhammad is often targeted as the Antichrist. So let's look at some more modern or contemporary expressions of this anti-Islam discourse. And I feel certain that you will recognize these from our discussions among our friends, in books, in magazines, in classrooms, and in the media. Islam is anti-modern, and I mean inherently. Of course, I've shortened things a little bit here. Authoritarian and undemocratic. Islam is anti-science. It's irrational. Islam hates women and is sexually perverse, sometimes both, sometimes one or the other. Islam is inherently violent. And perhaps you'll recognize from the popular writings of Bernard Lewis this notion that Muslims are filled with a jealous rage against the West, its freedoms, and its lifestyles, which is how we got to this rhetorical question, why do they hate us? Or in Bernard Lewis's version, what's wrong with Islam? Now, before I move on, let me say one more word, or perhaps not the final word, but yet another word about my methodology. I'm not particularly interested, though I'm happy to discuss it and I'm not void of opinion, but I'm not really interested in assessing whether these are true or not true. I'm not very interested in what I call the truth value of the discourse. I'm only interested in its formation, its operation, its persistence, and its effects. So I don't have to engage in a discussion about whether Islam could produce a democracy, though I should say for the record that in my book on Iran, I argue that it is possible, though it's not likely at this moment, that Iran will move to some sort of system that's both demonstrably Islamic and demonstrably democratic. But that's beside the point. In this work, I don't need to take that position because what I'm really looking at is what are the forces, as Cheryl mentioned in the intro, that lead us to think in one way and to avoid thinking or to prevent ourselves from thinking in another way. Some people may call that a cop-out as well, but when I was preparing this book, which originally was my PhD dissertation, my team of advisors said, you know, Jonathan, this is a brilliant idea, but it's impossible. So I actually got rid of one of the advisors, the one who was the one who really said it was impossible, and I found someone a little more docile. In fact, I had lunch with him the other day. He's from Australia, of course, but he was in town, and he was very pleased to get a copy of the book and that I had proven him wrong. So, as I mentioned, one of the most salient features of this discourse is its remarkable historical continuity. Now, I don't really have time today to take you through in detail its progression, but I hope to show you the outlines of how I find this progression from its inception in the run-up to the Crusades till today. And if you have the interest and the time to read the book, I think I make a strong argument whether I win you over or not. It's impossible to say. But let's look at this historical continuity. We have the genesis of this discourse in the mobilization for the First Crusade. We then have the scholastic scholars. Now, one reason I want to run through this is one of the tasks I face is not merely to chart Western antagonism towards Islam, but I'm trying to account for the ups and downs over the centuries in that relationship, because there were ups and downs. But there's a general arc in the direction of tensions. So the scholastics, I'm thinking here of Thomas Aquinas, Albertus Magnus. Thomas Aquinas could not have been Thomas Aquinas without Islamic philosophy, and he knew it. It's quite clear from his writings. Albertus Magnus. Many of the scholars of that period openly acknowledged their debt to Islamic philosophy and Islamic science. Now, when the humanists come in, the humanists are carving out new space in European society outside of the purview of the church. And so what they're doing is they're introducing this notion that Greece and Rome are a natural precursor, or that Western culture, I should say, is the natural, logical outcome of Greek and Latin cultures. So they're kicking not only the scholastics out of the picture, but they're taking out all its Arab and Muslim roots. So you get the father of the humanists, Petrarch, saying, don't tell me we inherited anything from those shiftless Arabs. A very famous letter he writes to his doctor. His doctor, who was trained in Arab medicine but is an Italian, is telling him, you have stomach aches, stop doing this, stop drinking cold water, and eating apples, I think was his advice. Petrarch gets very upset and says, don't tell me the Arabs, and then he goes on a whole rampage. And if you read his early letters, you'll see his engagement in pushing the Arabs out of the picture. Another topic I look at is the French early modern history accounts of algebra and its evolution. And what I did is I followed these through for about 100, 200 years. First French encyclopedia is very open about the Islamic roots of the science of algebra. But with each rewriting of the encyclopedia or each retelling, the Muslim-Arab contribution gets pushed out. And by the end of the process, algebra is not only a European creation, but guess what? It's a French creation. So I trace these through, and I'm going to have to move on. But I look at the early modern period. I look at Montesquieu and the Enlightenment. I look at the classic period of colonialism and Orientalism. And I I bring it all the way up to today's war on terrorism. Now, in addition to an enduring discourse, we have enduring themes. And each of these themes with the large bullet point form chapters in Islam Through Western Eyes. I look at Islam and science, or modernity, which was the subject of my previous book. I look at Islam and violence and Islam and women. And again, I don't, except for the odd aside or footnote, or when people really get outrageous, I don't take sides, as it were, in this debate. I tend to, so when I write about Islam and science, I don't write about all the great things that Arab and Muslim scientists did. I write about why we have such a hard time seeing and accounting for and explaining all the great things that Arab Muslim scientists, philosophers did. When I look at violence, I don't get deeply engaged in whether Islam in either its radical form today or in any form is inherently violent or naturally violent. But I look at how it is that this idea became established, unchallenged, and allowed to go along its way, forming one of these rules of discourse. And finally, the same with women. Now, one of the things I've found, and one of the things that interests me, is the role of what I call the Islam expert. Islam is an interesting topic. It's certainly been on the Western consciousness for at least 1,000 years. And yet it's very much what I would call a top-down subject. It's not easy to learn about Islam. So we rely on the Islam expert. Today's Islam expert is on CNN and Fox News. The Orientalist period Islam expert was working in Whitehall. The humanist expert was working in the court or trying to get a job as a chancellor in one of the Italian city-states or working in the Curia. There's always somebody who's telling us what it is to believe about Islam. And for the average consumer, and I acknowledge this openly, there's really not much choice. So we tend to accept what we're told. So we're going to look at how that plays out. Now, I've hinted at some of the corrosive power of Islam. I'm going to just run through these very quickly. It pervades our history of ideas, so our history of science. To give you a quick example, in Islamic law, those topics that get attention in Western study of Islamic law are those topics whose roots are clearly lie in Roman law or Hellenic law or perhaps Syriac Christian law from the Middle East. Those elements of Islamic law that seem to be either Islamic or pre-Islamic, perhaps indigenous to the Arabian Peninsula, get very little scholarly attention. So my suggestion is we're missing out on a part of the story. Why might that be? And of course, this power of discourse obscures our understanding as far as political aspirations, men, women, and the veil. So in short, the thesis of my book and my work is that this presence of the discourse denies Islam what we might call its independent existence. And in its most radical form, what I'm really saying is when we talk about Islam, we're talking about the Western idea of Islam. We're not talking about what I would technically call the non-discursive reality of Islam. In other words, we're not talking about the Islamic world outside these discourses. As a result, power flows to the Islam expert. Clearly, this can heighten global tensions because it gives a lot of credence to this notion of a clash of civilizations. By the way, when Huntington wrote that book, well, it first started out as an article in Foreign Affairs. He had a question mark at the end of the title. And it was ridiculed by the academic establishment. Things changed. He published a book, took out the question mark, became a bestseller, and it became a pocket explanation of what happened with the terrorism attacks of September 11th. Clearly, this has the danger of distorting our foreign policy and our domestic policy, and it can divide the world into us against them, making mutual accommodation, i.e. negotiation or peaceful resolution, almost impossible. So, with the remaining time left, I'm going to give you a quick example. Exhibit A, Islam and Women. I have here a quotation from Gustave Flaubert. I'll give you a second to read it. Everybody see it, or shall I read it? Look, look, and you will see the cities with domes of gold. Now, before I read it, I should say that Flaubert tells us he has climbed the Great Pyramid in Giza under a blistering sun at noon, or Not sure how noon fits with the account, but in any case, under a blistering sun, and he writes, "Look, look, you will see cities with domes of gold and minarets of porcelain, palaces of lava built on plinths of alabaster, marble-rimmed pools where sultanas bathe their bodies at the hour when the moon makes bluer the shadows of the groves and more limpid the silvery waters of the fountains." And then he exhorts us, open your eyes, open your eyes. There's only one problem. He wrote these lines 4 years before he ever got to the Middle East. So it's telling us a lot about what Flaubert thinks he's going to find, but not what he's seen because he hasn't yet been there. And this was actually remarkably common way that Orientalist literature and art is created. Gérard de Nerval, the French writer, complains in a wonderful letter to a friend that the Oriental cafes he's found in Cairo are less authentic than the Oriental cafes back in Paris. And one of my literary heroes, Melville, he threw up his hands and he couldn't deal with Cairo. There was too much chaos and order, and he demanded maps. And if any of you have been to Cairo, maps and Cairo don't really go together. So how did this happen? Well, the Westerner, in most cases of the period we're talking about, a male Westerner, wants to see and write about the Muslim woman, who's an elusive figure. In the upper middle classes and the upper classes, they are secluded. Poor women go out in the street and have to work and shop, veiled, of course. But the Muslim woman is essentially unavailable to the Western gaze. So what we see emerging are two strategies. The first one is if you can't see the woman, well, let's fill in the blanks and create the woman. So Flaubert has this idea of Oriental womanhood. He goes to Cairo, and he writes another letter to a friend complaining that all the whorehouses, all the bordellos are closed. It's ironic they were closed because Muhammad Ali was trying to please his French and British masters by modernizing Egypt. But in any case, Flaubert can't find what he's looking for, so he hires the famous courtesan Küçük Hanım, dancer and prostitute, to act out his fantasies, which then creates the basis for an enormously successful writing career when he gets home. We have the odalisque paintings. I'll show you one in a minute of Ingres and Delacroix. Again, most of the early ones painted long before either of them ever got to the Middle East. And of course, they could never get into the harem or the bath that they often depict. And I find it worth noting that they had ready access to the men's bath, but we don't get any pictures of lounging naked men. And they had ready access to the men's quarters in the houses, but again, we get no scenes of male domestic life. And then finally, the Oriental postcard. So what's interesting is not even photography, which we would tend to think of as an objective medium, can overcome the power of this discourse. Briefly, here's a picture Eugène Delacroix painted in 1827 or 1828. Very typical, the woman in repose, there's a hookah or some sort of pipe. Often there's a clothed servant, either a black eunuch or a female attendant, but almost always clothed to kind of re-emphasize the nakedness of the central figure. So let's look at the Oriental postcard. Again, they couldn't find these lascivious pictures of Oriental women, so they hired prostitutes and they went to the souks and they bought props. And the more industrious ones created whole photo studios to produce postcards, which they then sent back to Paris and London and Germany as a realistic representation of life in the Orient. And Malek Abdullah, who studied this, has a wonderful quotation, which I'll just read here. What the postcard proposes as the truth is but a substitute for something that does not exist. And I would argue that this happens today. And again, in the Q&A, I can give you some examples from my personal life as a reporter in the Middle East. And yet that which stands for news in the Middle East is often, I would argue, a substitute for something that does not even exist. Another tactic is to break down the harem walls and to tear off the veil. So this became the focus of Western colonial policy. Frequently, missionary schools restricted admissions to young Muslim girls unless they took their veils off and pressured their mothers to also unveil. Became the basis of modernization programs. And I would suggest that today's obsession with the veil in the Western media as a barometer of something, arguably social progress, reflects the same tendency. So what do we get? What are the effects? And I'm trying to show you with the example of women how these discourses corrode our understanding. Well, I would suggest we have an overt sexualization of the Western view of Islam. And this, in effect, reduces Muslim beliefs and practices, and arguably even their entire civilization, to this notion of the male-female dynamic. And again, the veil is the barometer of social progress. It's a shorthand for backwardness, immobility, the antithesis of human rights, and dignity. So I want to wrap up, and I'll leave time for questions, but I want to address probably the most common question I get when I speak at universities or public gatherings like this, to talk with my friends or bore my wife or whatever with this kind of stuff, is, well, what can be done? Well, I'm going to try to give you a few pointers that I hope will arm you to be a better consumer of the Islam expert at whose mercy we tend to be. So first off, I hope, even in this very cursory fashion, and perhaps even with greater optimism if you read the book, Islam Through Western Eyes, to recognize that there is, in fact, an anti-Islam discourse. That's the first step. That there are rules that govern the production of statements about Islam and the Muslims. And that these rules shape our study of the subject and of policies that we make and of responses when we hear something. I'm almost out of time, but just quickly, I was in Cairo when the Oklahoma bombing took place. And I was on holiday, but my wife was the Middle East correspondent for the Dallas Morning News. And we got a call at some ungodly hour saying, you have to go to Gaza. It had all the signs of Middle Eastern terrorism. So those of you who know the region can imagine that we packed our bag like hurry, and we ran down to the Marriott Hotel, and we hired a taxi to drive us across the Sinai Desert in the middle of the night so that we could, I just went for fun, but she was working. That's my idea of fun, what can I say? We got there, of course it turned out, well, not of course, but it turned out not to have been Middle Eastern terrorism. But I was looking back on that incident, I'm interested to see that a major newspaper, and we were hardly alone, deploying their big resources into, before they had any idea what had actually happened. And of course, again, to underscore these rules, this typo should be rules, are outside the knowledge or control of the authors. So recognize there's a discourse, understand its power, how it can distort our thinking intellectually, politically, in academia. Become a better consumer of text. Learn to read critically in light of what we've now learned, that there may be, in fact, a discourse operating that's deflecting our understanding of what I'd like to call a non-discursive reality. Challenge the experts. As a sociologist, I like to ask the classic question, who benefits? And in fact, it's one of the themes I do in the book. I try to show how throughout the ages, across these different issues of women, violence, science, or modernity, there's always been an expert across each cohort, a cohort of experts, who benefit directly from their discourse. And their interests may not be our interests. And then finally, practice what I call the strategy of reversal. It's actually a tactic that Michel Foucault, some of you in this room may recognize. A lot of my theoretical work draws on the philosophy of Michel Foucault. He advocates a strategy of reversal, which you negate the idea that this discourse is actually revealing this non-discursive reality. And to close, I'll just take you very, very quickly how this might look in light of contemporary news about Iran and its apparent drive for nuclear technology. It seems to me the West is faced with a conundrum. Would a nuclear Iran be just another nuclear state? China has nukes. France has nukes. North Korea has nukes. Would it be a particularly reckless nuclear state? Or would it in fact be an Islamic nuclear state? And I think how this question gets answered, and you can judge for yourself how it might be answered today, but how this question is answered in the long run, I would suggest, is going to determine the policy reactions, public opinion, and possibly the decision to use military force or not. And if we practice this idea of reversal, and what I mean by reversal is, even as a thought experiment, take the notion that Islam is inherently violent and just set it aside. Just even if you believe that it is, and I'm not arguing at this point, but just go with me, set it aside for a moment. What would you see? Well, you'd see that there might be other motivations, or big power motivations, traditional nation state motivations for an Iranian nuclear program. This then might open the way for negotiation, and it would eliminate military force as the default option. Because clearly we can live with certain states with nuclear weapons, but we can't live, perhaps, or we're telling ourselves that we can't live with others. So finally, the way forward, and perhaps the next project that I'll take on in this series, is to shift the emphasis. That's what I tried to do in my previous book, The House of Wisdom, to show the deep Western connection to Muslim and Islamic culture, and relocate Islam in the West in a shared cultural space. We would move away from what might be called intracultural contests to from intercultural to intracultural. In other words, competing within the same space. And this would allow us to write a hidden history of Islam. And I'm working now with other scholars to look at legal history, history of science, historiography or history of philosophy, Western study of Islamic theology, and say, okay, we're going to set all these discourses aside. What might that free us to do in our academic and intellectual world? And that's a project I'm hoping to work on in the coming years. So with that, I want to thank you, and I want to open the floor to questions. I should also say, I have to say this as a person who relies on his writing, that there are books for sale. I'd be happy to sign them. I also have some business cards if you'd like to go to my website and read about my other activities, and I have some flyers here. So, yes, ma'am, you had a question.
I'm wondering if Islamic leaders are attempting to change the discourse within their own pockets of influence to take back their perspective of a more positive centrist from the terrorists.
Right. That's a good question, and the question in short was, what, if anything, are leading figures in the Islamic world doing to change their own discourse that has us at tension and conflict with the West? I can answer that, but I have to be honest, that's not... I'm sorry.
Tension, conflict within their own...
Oh, within their own societies. Again, I can wing it, and I will, because that's what I do. But it's not a field that I actually study too much, which is the internal discourse within Islam. They have many of the same problems that a lot of these discourses act and interact outside of their knowledge. So they first need to acknowledge the presence of a sort of, they would have to get to the genesis of the conflict with their own society. I sense that that's still a long way off. But again, I have to duck out a little bit on that one. It's not really a field that I'm not really an Islamist scholar of Islam and of Arab as much as I am of the Western idea of Islam. Yes, sir.
Well, I may be the only born Muslim in this crowd.
No, I don't think so. Always a dangerous thing to say.
I want to say that you use the word Islam as one Islam. I belong to a group called Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy.
Yes.
We wanted to call it Center for Islam and Democracy. And people said, democracy means so many different things, and Islam means so many different things. So I'd like to stress here that Islam in Pakistan is different than Islam in Egypt, where I'm from, different than Islam in Saudi Arabia.
No, I understand that, sir, and I don't want to cut you off, but I do want to cut you off because, again, and perhaps I need to make this more clear because it often comes up in my work, I am not a student, or I'm not, in this case, acting as a student of Islam. I would agree with you 100% from where you're coming, but I would disagree within my own context because I find the Western apprehension of Islam to be unitary. And That's what I'm studying. Yes, sir.
It's interesting that the West doesn't have all the same attitude toward other religions. For example, Buddhism.
Yes.
So.
The friendly religions.
Yeah, friendly religion. But maybe Islam is unfriendly, perceived in the Western eyes, and Judaism as well used to be that way. What do you think is the basic motivation of that?
Okay, very good question. It was asked, what is the driving force behind the tensions between Islam and the West historically that do not apply to perhaps to other faiths? Well, part of the reason is the very real threat, and I don't mean necessarily military threat, but a cultural, intellectual, and political threat that Islam represented over many, many centuries to Western. I mean, they were a major military and industrial force, a major intellectual force, and frankly, the language of Islam is extremely powerful, and the church recognized very early that this was a very serious rival that had to be nipped in the bud. Buddhism, our interaction with Buddhism is completely different and separate from notions of state power. Judaism is interesting, and I talk a little bit about the discourse of Judaism. I felt I had to get into it a little bit in my discussion. There's a very important distinction. In the Christian worldview, the Jew can be persecuted, though that's not necessarily a good thing, but cannot be eliminated. You know, they were called the living figures of the word, I guess is the translation. A number of clerics, church fathers even write about the importance of the Jew to Christian life. Look at the Jew, went wrong, remember our heritage, we're going in the right direction. So you can't, well, persecution, pogroms, terrible things happen to the Jews in the name of Christian faith in the period that I'm looking at. Elimination was never really the point or the object. But I think elimination of the Muslim was a value at some point. So you had territorial disputes because you had a huge territory, but fault lines, if you will, between the Islamic world and the Western world, which you never had with Buddhism. Judaism, until the modern era, was not affiliated with any sort of notion of a nation state, and its affiliation with the nation state is still a very difficult question. So I think all of those reasons. Yes, sir.
Just a very, very brief comment on that. If you happen to be from one of the Middle Eastern Christian churches, you would realize that that statement you made is not quite correct, because much of what Dr. Lyons said about Western attitudes toward Islam could be said about Western attitudes toward those
Orthodox.
heretical,
Yes.
unwashed Eastern Christians.
Thank you.
It's not just religion.
Right, thank you. We had a question here, ma'am.
Yes, you have lived in the Middle East and you in the Islamic societies, and you may be aware of some of the prejudice against the West there. Have you ever thought about writing a book, say, Christianity through the Islamic eyes?
Well, when this project started, one of my advisors, not the guy who told me I couldn't do it, the one who survived, he said, well, you know, when you're done, Jonathan, you should publish this, and then you should hook up with a Arabist or Islamist scholar, and together. And it's a great project. There's no question about it. And I have no doubt that you would find many of the same ideas. But I don't want to be rude, but I want to focus your attention that the questions so far have always been within what I'm really make my argument for me, because that's not what I do. I'm here to talk about the Western idea of Islam, and you, a respectful and respected audience, and I don't mean any disrespect, this happens everywhere, ask me questions that really only reinforce the argument that I've just made for you, which is that we have one way of thinking about Islam. So you want to know why they hate us. I'm not going to answer. Yes, sir.
Let me accept your challenge. And to shift gears, there is a new book on George F. Kennan, who was the architect of our strategy during the Cold War.
Yes.
And when he put forward his idea about containment of the Soviet Union, that was outside the box. up until that time, Henry Wallace, for example, said either we're going to appease Russia or we're going to have a war. Yet he was able to think outside the box. I'd like to ask your analysis of that in terms of discourse. It seems to me that was a discursive analysis that gave rise to a significant change.
Yes, it did.
How could that happen again today regarding our relationships with the Muslim world?
I think it'd be wonderful if it could. It's interesting you mentioned that. I actually began my life as a scholar of Russian and the Soviet Union and have my undergraduate degree in Russian. Lived in the Soviet Union as a student when Brezhnev was still in charge, so I have some Soviet experience. And then went to Reuters Moscow Bureau in 1989 and covered the collapse of the Soviet Union and interviewed Gorbachev and all that fun stuff. So I have a soft spot in my heart for discussing George Kennan. I have a weak spot in my resume, perhaps, about not knowing quite the dynamic of how that worked, but it is an excellent example. And I don't want to leave you with the notion that what I'm calling discourses are immutable. But I do want to suggest that for reasons that I try to get at in my book and can only sometimes be left guessing or hinting at, is that Islam seems to be, the discourse of Islam seems to be a particularly immutable one. So not particularly amenable to one brilliant guy at the State Department and in academia coming up with a new paradigm, if you will, but it is a wonderful example that ideas matter, that personalities matter, and that there is a politics of ideas out there. How that could be? Well, again, I would go back to my slide here, summing up what we all need to do. And until the recognition that our idea of Islam is not, in fact, what I recognize as Islam, but a non-discursive Western construct, most people, in response to your question, people in power, in my experience, would say, well, we don't need to rethink. Let me tell you a quick story. I had a colleague who was in Bahrain very recently. She's a very good researcher on Islam and Islamic politics. And she interviewed all the Shia activists who were not in jail, some who had just gotten out of jail. And she came back and she went to a Washington think tank, and a congressman gave a talk, and he dismissed the notion that what's going on in Bahrain could somehow be driven by Shia-Sunni tension. And it was all Iran's fault. It was all about power politics. So my friend stood up and said, well, excuse me, Senator or Congressman, I'm so-and-so, and I write these books, and I'm this and that. And I just got back from Bahrain, and I interviewed every Shia person and the Sunni and every well-known researcher. And what did the congressman say? He said, well, you were in Bahrain, but I'm in Washington. That is, unfortunately, a true story. Yes, sir.
I was wondering, historically, who's benefited from this perception, and if that's the same as who's benefiting now, and also on the Western side and the Arabic side, if that's possible, there's benefit on the Arab side.
Oh, there's no question that, but I'm just going to stay true to my discourse and address the Western side. And I'm going to run through this list. Very early on, it was church ideologues. A lot of people don't realize that the First Crusade was very much driven by progressive thinkers within the church. They needed to revitalize the church. They crafted an idea of Christian holy war. Gregory VII was very instrumental in this. His protege eventually became Pope, known as Pope Urban II. As I mentioned, the humanists in the early modern period, the humanists used the anti-Islam discourse to advance their social, intellectual, and economic standing by winning positions in courts, at universities, writing books for lots of money, pushing out this notion that Western culture owes any kind of debt to Arab, Muslim thinking, science, philosophy. In the Enlightenment, Montesquieu writes his famous book, Persian Letters, in which he uses this notion that the harem and what he calls despotism, he uses as an allegory for what he sees going on in France. So he benefits by casting this notion. In the Enlightenment, Hegel and others write about how Islam has no history, that Muslims created some great things, but it never can last. And I argue in my book that when colonialism interacts directly with the Islamic world, one of the things they do is they step in and fill Hegel's vacuum and say, well, there's no Islamic history. We're going to give them a history. And so a history is created, just like the image of a woman is created. And today's war on terrorism very much benefited from the same discourse. That how did it benefit? Well, Thomas Friedman, one of the most powerful people in this country, I don't know if he still does, but for a year or more after the September 11th attacks, was still insisting in print that the people who perpetrated that attack had no demands. Why is that important? Well, he then goes on to explain that this was an act of pure evil. Now, setting aside whether it was an act of evil, a pure evil, or otherwise, the point is there were demands, very well known. You can read them in English. You could have read them in English a couple of years before the attack. PBS website has them if you don't read Arabic. They were specific demands. So the point is, we don't see what we need to see. If someone makes demands and say, if you don't do this, I'm going to strap on a bomb and blow you up, that doesn't mean you accede to the demands. But if you know that there are demands, it's a very different reaction to why someone did this. So when we look at suicide bombing, which is a very complex and emotive issue, and I understand that, our tendency is to say it was driven by this notion that it'll be rewarded with sexual paradise or some other teaching within Islam. It allows us to say that could not have been a rational act by a rational person pushed in a condition that we are unable to imagine. But I think you could make that argument. Whether you'd be right or not, again, is a different issue. So the point is, are we seeing the real motivations? Because when you don't see your adversary's motivations, you can only do is shoot first and ask questions later. So all these groups benefit by perpetuating. So what I like to do, I'm going to leave you with this thought because I think we're out of time. Think of the discourse, the anti-Islam discourse, as a cookbook. I cook a lot. I like to cook. But I can't cook everything. So if I bring home something that I've never cooked or I can't remember how to cook, what do? I go to my shelf, take down Julia Child or one of my cookbooks, and I get a refresher. So the anti-Islam discourse, it sits on the shelf. There are whole periods of history where it really doesn't matter. But when it matters, we take down the book, we open it to page 37, and we say, aha, that's what's motivating this. We act accordingly, crisis passes, we close the cookbook, we eat our meal, we put it back on the shelf. So with that, I want to thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.